Okay, moving on from our last video, which was an introduction to Parliament, the Commons, the Lords and the role of the monarch. This video is about trends in Parliament, how Parliament has changed and some of the key individuals within it. So I've identified, and the textbook identifies, 7 ways in which Parliament has changed over the years. And I'm going to go through them briefly, one by one. First of all, democracy. The electorate has grown. Larger working class men were first given the vote in the 19th century. Full equal suffrage between the sexes was granted in 1928, and those aged 18 and over were given the right to vote in 1969. Before then, you had to be 21 to have the right to vote. So as the UK has become more democratic and as more people have joined the electorate, Parliament has changed and the people within it has changed. Parliament can be said to represent more of the population, and therefore we've seen changes in the laws as a result. Secondly, the balance of power. Historically, the Lords was the most influential House of Parliament, but developments in the 20th century meant that the House of Commons became more powerful. In 1911, a Parliament Act was passed, which meant that the Lords could no longer veto legislation, that means to block it altogether. Instead, they could just simply delay it. And in 1949, that delay ability of the Lords was further eroded in the Parliament Act of 1949. The House of Lords could delay bills for 2 sessions over 1 year. In the past, they were able to delay it for 3 sessions over the course of 2 years. So the ability of the Lords to delay legislation was reduced in terms of timing. Next up is diversity. We don't get the first female MP to take a seat until Nancy Astor in 1919. There was a Sinn Féin MP who's the first elected female MP because she belonged to Sinn Féin, who don't recognise Britain's authority over the people of Ireland. Constance Markievicz never took her seat. In 2029, there were a record number of female MPs, 220, and 65 black and minority ethnic MPs. And so Parliament is said to be becoming less male, pale and stale than it was in the past. It still doesn't absolutely mirror British society, but it is more diverse than it has ever been. Number 4, checks and balances. The presence of government whips mean that the governing party is able to pass legislation quite easily, especially when the government has a healthy majority. But there are examples of Parliament balancing and placing a check upon the Prime Minister's power in the form of backbench rebellions. The most famous example is January 2019. Theresa May's first attempt to get her Brexit deal through Parliament was rejected by 230 votes. That was the largest government defeat in Parliament in history, and that's because it was voted against by Labour and opposition parties, but also by conservative Eurosceptics who felt that the relationship between Britain and the EU was still too close. It went up again in March. It was rejected by 149 votes. It actually went up twice in March. It was rejected each time. And that Brexit bill and its failure to pass ultimately led to the downfall of Theresa May altogether. Number 5, committees. These are groups of MPs, usually in most scenarios, with a government majority on them, and they are used as a committee to provide a forum of discussion and debate on particular legislation and particular issues away from the Commons floor. In 2022, we had the situation where Home Secretary Priti Patel refused to appear in front of a parliamentary committee concerning the government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to be processed there. Number 6, broadcasting. The Hansard has always recorded debates in Parliament, and therefore there is a written record of what has been said. But the B stands for broadcasting because since the 1980s, 1989, debates in Parliament have been televised, quite often live parliamentary sessions. You can catch them on BBC Parliament. Quite often Prime Minister's questions will be shown on Sky News, and also radio broadcasters like LBC will play clips from Prime Minister's questions in particular. And so parliamentarians are increasingly aware of what they say is going out to a larger audience. It's not just being heard by those fellow parliamentarians, particularly in the Commons, and therefore there is an increased scrutiny on what is said and by whom. Finally, number 7, another trend and change that has occurred to Parliament is very recent, and that's devolution and membership of the EU. That meant that decisions have been taken outside of Westminster, and in the case of devolution, particularly in Scotland, where there are tax varying powers, but also in Wales and Northern Ireland too, many issues affecting those parts of the United Kingdom are in fact decided in those devolved assemblies rather than at Westminster. And of course, historically, Britain being a member state of the EU up until 31st of January 2020, and when Britain left, the influence of that European Union legislation was no longer felt in Britain. So those are the 7 changes, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, that have affected Parliament and how it operates. Okay, let's talk now about some of the influential and important people, particularly in the House of Commons. First of all is the Prime Minister, and there isn't a picture of the Prime Minister up here because as this video is being recorded, Boris Johnson is a caretaker Prime Minister waiting to resign his position officially in September, and at the time of recording this, it will either be Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss that will be Prime Minister following on from him. But the Prime Minister is the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons and almost always has a majority of MPs from the same party. The last Prime Minister not to have a majority of MPs was Theresa May after 2017. She was just short of a majority in the Commons and signed a confidence and supply agreement with the DUP. Parliament, in theory, is a check on the executive, but we get the executive from Parliament. So the Prime Minister and Cabinet sit in and direct parliamentary debates. And therefore there has been some criticism as the extent that Parliament provides scrutiny of the executive, and Prime Ministers with large majorities can control the business of the Commons far easier than those that do not. Boris Johnson, after becoming Prime Minister in 2019, had an 80-seat majority, and he found it much easier to get his legislative programme, particularly regarding Brexit, through Parliament compared with Theresa May, who didn't enjoy a majority at all. Now, if anyone's seen Prime Minister's questions, it's like a particularly rowdy and not so very well-behaved classroom. And so the person with authority on the Commons floor is the Speaker of the House of Commons, and at the time of recording that is Sir Lindsay Hoyle MP. Once was a Labour MP for Chorley, but now sits as Speaker of the House. Now, the Speaker of the House must not be party affiliated and resigns their membership, so to speak. And the role of the Speaker is to keep order and to allow a range of MPs to speak in debates. During Prime Minister's questions, there is a section of the debate where MPs can indicate that they wish to speak simply by standing up out of their seat, and it is the job of the Speaker to allow those individuals to speak. The Speaker administers the rules of the Commons, and MPs can be suspended. They can be sent away from the Commons chamber if they break the rules. Now, one of the rules is that you cannot accuse another Member of Parliament of lying, because the assumption is that our MPs would not do that. Now, that might be somewhat ironic when you think about the reason why Boris Johnson was told by his senior members of Cabinet to resign from office. That was for misleading the public of his knowledge into the Chris Pincher sexual harassment allegations. But the assumption is that an MP or a Prime Minister would never lie to the British people, and therefore a fellow member cannot accuse another one of lying. A famous example of an MP being removed from the Commons was the Beast of Bolsover, an MP by the name of Dennis Skinner. And whilst David Cameron was still Prime Minister, Dennis Skinner referred to the Prime Minister as Dodgy Dave. The Speaker of the time, John Bercow, told him to retract that statement. Dennis Skinner refused and was therefore sent out of the Commons chamber for calling the Prime Minister dodgy. As I said, the current Speaker of the House of Commons is Sir Lindsay Hoyle. He was elected by his fellow parliamentarians in November 2019. And after the general election, he had to stand again in December. So he sort of faced another vote just a month into his job, where he was subsequently re-elected. As I said, the Speaker sort of renounces their party allegiance upon taking the post, and they are intended to be impartial. The next individual I want to talk about is the Leader of the House of Commons. Since February 2022, that has been Mark Spencer MP. You can see him there in the middle of your screen. He was a former Chief Whip for the government. We'll talk about the whips in just one moment. But essentially, the Leader of the House of Commons is a member of the Cabinet and is in charge of running the business of government. They're in charge of timetabling debates and bills. On Thursday, each week in Parliament, the Leader of the House, their job is to inform the House of the next week's business, and they liaise with the Chief Whip on how that business will run. The role of the Whip to ensure that MPs vote in the way that the government wants them to requires the careful timetabling of important debates. You want a decent attendance from government MPs if you are working in the Whip's office, because the more that you have the opportunity to have all of your MPs in Parliament, the more chance it is that that legislation is going to be successful. Next up is the Whips, led by the Chief Whip, and the current Chief Conservative Whip is Chris Heaton-Harris, elected in 2022 when Mark Spencer, who we've just talked about, became Leader of the House of Commons, replacing Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, the Whips are a group of individuals led by the Chief Whip, and the term comes from fox hunting. The whipper was someone who's in charge of keeping a pack of hounds in order. And therefore, the Whips are in charge of party discipline to make sure that MPs are voting in the way that the government wishes them to. Now, they're able to use a range of persuasive techniques to try and ensure that MPs vote in the way that the leadership desires. And historically, tales were told that the Whips were the individuals with all the knowledge. They knew who had skeletons in their closet that they didn't want to get out, and Whips would often use that as a form of blackmail to get MPs to behave in the way that they do. And the work of MPs the work of Whips in terms of persuading MPs is quite shadowy. We don't quite know how MPs are lobbied by the Whips, and for that reason, that old stereotype of blackmail and shady deals lingers on in the modern era. And the Whip can be removed. We're going to talk about the case of Tobias Ellwood in just a moment. But essentially, the Whips, the team of Whips, are in charge of delivering the business of Parliament for the day in the pigeonhole of each individual MP. And it's quite easy for the team of Whips because each MP, outside the Commons and Lords lobby, MPs and peers, there is a sticker to identify which party they belong to. So the government team of Whips just need to look for the blue stickers next to the names, and they put the parliamentary business of the day in those pigeonholes. And they will place a 1, 2 or 3 line whip on legislation. Let's talk about the case of Tobias Ellwood, who is pictured there. There was a 3-line whip in July 2022 when the government basically brought forward a vote of confidence in itself. Now, Labour initially tabled the motion of no confidence in the government and Boris Johnson after he'd said that he intended to resign in September. The government rejected that motion and refused to have it heard because it didn't just refer to the government, it referred to the individual Boris Johnson. So the vote of confidence was reworded to say whether or not MPs still had confidence in the government. Tobias Ellwood MP was a Conservative who missed that vote, and that vote was a 3-line whip, which means that you better have the best excuse in the world not to be there voting in line with your party's wishes. And so the government placed a 3-line whip on its own vote of confidence. Tobias Ellwood missed it because he was unable to get back from Moldova in time. He was visiting with the president of Moldova, couldn't get a flight back in time, missed the vote, and therefore had the Conservative whip removed, which means that he is no longer considered a Conservative MP in the House of Commons. And having the whip removed is the ultimate means of party discipline. That is the way in which long-term backbench rebels, individual MPs that are quite frankly a pain for the whips team to deal with and for the government to deal with, they can take the whip away, which means that they are no longer a party MP. In September 2019, 21 Conservative MPs were booted from the party when they failed to support a government motion during the Brexit process. And that was a decision taken by Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson. Of the 21 rebels who had the whip removed, only 10 had it eventually restored and given back to them. And the final group of people I want to talk about as important in the House of Commons are the so-called front benchers. Named so because they sit on the front bench of the lobby in the House of Commons. You can see there Boris Johnson during his last ever Prime Minister's questions, turning to the Speaker to make his point. But you can see on the front bench from right to left, on the right we have Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, and Nadhim Zahawi, who was made Chancellor after the massive resignations led by then-Chancellor Rishi Sunak. And then you can see on the far left, we've got Mark Spencer just by to the left of the microphone. And the front benchers are the Prime Minister's cabinet. They are MPs with a ministerial responsibility. And it's not just the case on the side of the government. There are also front benchers on the opposition benches. So quite often when Sir Keir Starmer stands up in debates in the House of Commons, Deputy Leader Angela Rayner will be right by his side. Any MP that is not granted a ministerial responsibility, like Nadhim Zahawi, like Priti Patel, like Mark Spencer, are referred to as backbenchers. Your bog standard ordinary MP representing their constituency with no other major responsibility are simply referred to as a backbencher. So there you have it, a brief run through of recent changes to Parliament and how outside influences have changed the way that it looks and works, and some of the most important people in it. A quick recap then. So first of all, 7 ways in which Parliament has changed in the 20th and 21st century. Democracy has meant that Parliament has become more representative of a wider range of people. The balance of power has shifted away from the Lords and towards the House of Commons. Parliament has become more diverse. Parliament generally provides a check and a balance on the executive, the Prime Minister and Cabinet, but because the Prime Minister and Cabinet sit in the Commons, scrutiny and checks on the government are often criticised. Committees have been brought in and used on a range of issues to make sure that legislation is thoroughly scrutinised. We'll talk about the committee stage of legislation later on. Broadcasting has changed Parliament. MPs are very aware that how they behave and what they say and what they do is televised. You might remember the famous image of Jacob Rees-Mogg reclining on the Commons seats. He was much criticised for that. Nadine Dorries in 2022 was criticised for shouting "you're boring" while Sir Keir Starmer was talking to the Commons, and so MPs are very much under the microscope when they speak in Parliament. And then finally, devolution and our past membership of the EU has meant that some issues have been the responsibility of other assemblies. Obviously now the EU is a historic challenge to the supremacy of Westminster. However, in Stormont in Northern Ireland, Holyrood in Scotland and the Senedd in Wales, there are certain issues dealt with in the other areas of the United Kingdom that aren't dealt with at Westminster. And then finally, on slide 2, we talked about some of the key people in Parliament, starting with the Prime Minister, the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons, and quite often their power and influence depends on the size of the government's majority in the House of Commons. Then we talked about the role of the Speaker, who is essentially in charge of making sure that debates are conducted in the right and proper way and that rules are being followed and that order is restored when MPs can get out of hand, which happens more often than anyone would like that to be the case. The Leader of the House of Commons essentially runs the business of government on the government's behalf, and he or she is a member of Cabinet, so that's currently Mark Spencer, so he is both a Cabinet Minister but also leading the government's business in the Commons. We talked about the influence of whips in all parties to ensure that MPs vote in the way that the party wants them to. The government's chief whip, Chris Heaton-Harris, appointed in 2022 when Mark Spencer moved from the whip's office to become leader of the House of Commons. I also mentioned that the whip can be withdrawn. I gave the example of Tobias Ellwood in 2022. Another example is 2012, Nadine Dorries. I'm mentioning that individual again in this video. Nadine Dorries agreed to go on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in 2012 before informing the government that she intended to do so. And by being on the show, she missed parliamentary sessions, and because she did so, she had the whip temporarily removed. It wasn't the end of her Conservative political career. Upon returning to her day job after being on I'm a Celebrity, she was able to become a Conservative MP once more and then rose to Cabinet under Boris Johnson. And of course, we finally talked about the difference between front benchers and back benchers. If you sit on the front bench of the government or opposition side of Parliament, you have a ministerial responsibility. If you do not, and you are an ordinary MP with a responsibility for your constituency alone, you are referred to as a backbencher. As I said in the last video, you might just want to sit and listen to this and take it in. You might want to make notes. You might want to go back and do that again at another time, either now or during revision. And I certainly recommend that you do whatever works best for you.